Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're very pleased to have with us this evening David Rothkopf, who's here to talk about his new book, American Resistance, the inside story of how the deep state saved the nation. As many of you may be aware, the idea of a deep state was co-opted and spread early in the Trump years by Donald Trump and his supporters. It was meant to portray a sinister, secretive assortment of government officials using their leverage in the federal bureaucracy to oppose change or at least oppose Trump's initiatives. Of course, this notion of some kind of grand coordinated underground conspiracy was, well, far-fetched. But there's no denying that a number of officials at various levels of government were quite alarmed at some of what Trump was trying to do and did their best at some risk to their careers and to their reputations to thwart him. In his book, David recounts some important instances in which government officials intervened to undermine Trump's most troubling orders and policy initiatives, not because these moves posed some kind of threat to their own entrenched interests, but because they were illegal, unworkable, immoral, or against the country's interests. Now, if you look at David's own biography, you might think he's something of a deep stater himself. After all, he's one of those Washington individuals who has moved ably between the worlds of public service and private business. After an initial career in magazine publishing, he shifted into government during the Clinton administration, where he served as Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce. He then returned to the private sector, where he helped manage Kissinger Associates and founded his own advisory firm. Later, he headed the FP Group, which publishes Foreign Policy magazine, and he's authored 9 or 10 other books, mostly on national security or economic topics. And nowadays, he writes columns for the Daily Beast and hosts the podcast Deep State Radio. Now, that's pretty suspicious, wouldn't you say, especially the name of the podcast, Deep State Radio. If that isn't hiding in plain sight, I don't know what is. Anyway, David argues in his book that rather than condemn those who bravely resisted Trump as part of a bureaucratic cabal, we should thank them for helping to diffuse bad policy ideas, avert or undo disastrous decisions, and basically save our democracy. His book is not just an homage to these officials, it's also a compelling, well-reported warning that guardrails need to be strengthened to protect against future abuses of power. Conversation with David will be Edward Luce of the Financial Times, where he's a U.S. national editor and columnist. As an experienced journalist, Ed has been reporting on and commenting about American and international developments for some time. He's also the author of 3 books, most recently, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, and he co-writes the FT's Swamp Notes newsletter. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Rothkopf and Ed Luce. So, David.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and also it's just great to be back here again. And particularly great to be here with David, my friend David Rothkopf, also a colleague of sorts. I most weeks appear on Deep State Radio, the Conspiracy in Plain View, which, if you're not a podcast listener, this is how you should, break your teeth on it. So, David, let's get straight to your book. This is a wonderful book. I mean, this is a really good book. And the thing that first struck me when reading it, all the way through really, was that the question kept occurring in my head, did this really just happen? Because I'd become so acclimatized, like most people, and benumbed and unshockable, that I had forgotten that Trump not just wanted to build a wall, but wanted to build a moat all along the wall, and the moat would have crocodiles and snakes in it. And this wasn't some of...
Alligators.
Alligators, sorry. Crocodiles, alligators. We're going to be divided by a common language throughout this. Or that he was at some D-Day celebration in Europe where he refuses to go to a World War II cemetery because it was full of losers. Or that he wanted to strike refugee caravans coming up from Central America with missiles. And hurricanes with nuclear weapons, and so on. That did this really just happen? Well, I guess my first question to you is, I mean, you have brought out very vividly the sense of shock that I thought I'd lost just by rereading this and the detail that you provide. What was it in researching and writing this book that most startled you?
Well, that's a really good question. Because I, of course, do remember these things happened, and I'm a little worried you don't.
It's coming back.
It's coming, yeah. It's PTSD. But, the book, you're nice to say the nice things, and so are you. But I, to the extent I wrote it, I actually compiled it. I spoke to 100 people. 100 former senior U.S. government officials. And I tried to let them, people who had been in the Trump administration, people who had been in the cabinet or in the sub-cabinet or in agencies across the government, tell their story. And, that's the best part of doing any book. You talk to people and they share their insights. What was striking to me was where they were fairly unanimous. Almost all of them had served in prior administrations of the people I'd spoken to. And almost all of them within the first several weeks of this administration or sooner during the transition or the campaign said, this is not like any government I've ever been in. Almost all of them realized in that same time frame that Trump could be dangerous, irrational, that he didn't listen to advisors in the sense of government officials, although he might well listen to the last guy he talked to on the golf course. And so that was striking. And there were other areas where there was this kind of unanimity. For example, almost all of them stayed longer than they wanted to because they were afraid of what would happen next. They thought the prospect of Trump not being challenged by people who put the rule of law first was dangerous, and that he was working towards that goal. They thought the prospect of Trump gaining re-election would lead to a worse circumstance. And let me say one thing briefly here, if I can add, that follows on the introduction as well. The reason I use the term deep state is because it's very important we sort of ask ourselves the question, why have they made up this conspiracy theory? And the reason they've made up this conspiracy theory is very much akin to the reason they refer to fake news. They want to discredit people or institutions that could impede them on their way to their goals. And this so-called deep state are actually public servants who take an oath to the Constitution, who place the rule of law in the Constitution ahead of loyalty to party or person. And so therefore, they represented a big threat to Trump and to those around him, and they wanted to discredit them. And they, that has gotten to, these people were very successful in impeding some of their worst ideas, not all of them, but some of them. And so by the end of the administration, they decided they were going to try to find a way to fire them. or replace them wherever they could without Senate confirmation. And then they floated this idea of Schedule F, and you're Washingtonians and insiders and so forth, so you may know what Schedule F is. Most Americans don't, and it's sort of under the radar. But the idea was, let's be able to fire these public servants, because then we can replace them with loyalists. And that is a step towards authoritarianism. It's a step towards gutting one of the last effective guardrails that we had to preserve our system. And I have to say, all these people clearly understood and articulated that risk. Cabinet members, sub-cabinet, and so forth. And that was striking to me, because I would have thought there was more of a range of views.
So the book is about people who did the right thing. I mean, good people who did the right thing, sometimes not so good people, but who at the right moment, for some reason, did the right thing. I think Mike Pence.
Bill Barr.
And we can get into those later, but I just want to stick on the good people, the Masha Yovanovitches, the Vindman brothers, Fiona Hill, George Kent, Mark Zaid, the whistleblower, people like that. Oh, Dan Coates, Director of National Intelligence. If you'd looked at their resumes before the Trump administration and then everyone else's, would you have predicted that those would have been the ones who stood up for loyalty to the Constitution rather than the man? Because, these are clearly key people. Is there a pattern to what kind of people they are? Can we learn something from these names?
There are patterns among those people. Some of them were immigrants or children of immigrants, and they had a special appreciation for the country and for patriotism. But let me say something. This is going to be very shocking for you to hear from me, but let me say something fatuous that sounds Pollyannish. I first came to Washington, and this is going to be hard for you to believe. Please don't laugh. But I first came to Washington when I was right out of college. I worked as a press secretary to a congressman called Stephen Solars in 1979. My first meeting was with the subject of your next book, with Zbigniew Brzezinski. And I then came back during the Clinton administration. I've spent the last 30 years deeply involved in Washington ever since. And I have a view of people in Washington and people in government that's contrary to what I call Reagan's big lie. Not Trump's big lie, but it was the big lie that led to the big lie. And Reagan's big lie was government is the enemy. And that's an incredibly dangerous lie, because it leads you to people discounting the conclusions of government about an election. It leads you to people not wanting to go into public service. It leads you to thinking, oh, well, government doesn't matter. I could have a brain-damaged former football player as a United States senator. Who cares, right? And that's dangerous, and it led us here. But here's the thing. In my time in Washington, 95% of the people I've met in the U.S. government, Republicans, Democrats, and independent, were public servants who are here to do the right thing, who are good people. And because they're your neighbors, because they live here in Washington and you encounter them. And some of them may be annoying in some respects, and some of their bureaucracies may be slow and unresponsive and so forth. But they all could have made more money doing something else. They didn't go to Wall Street. They didn't, most of them, they decided to stay here and to slog it out as a public servant. And so, I'm not so surprised that they would do the right thing, because the vast majority of public servants I know take an oath and uphold the oath. Some do it well, some don't do it as well. I'm not foolish about it, but they take this stuff very seriously. And if I may conclude that point, in the book, one of the people who captures this extremely well is Congressman Jamie Raskin, who I think is a national treasure. That's my own personal view. But Congressman Jamie Raskin talks about what these people did in upholding the law, respecting the Constitution, and so forth. He calls it constitutional patriotism. And that sounds a little jingoistic, but it's right. And these people, for the most part, are constitutional patriots. And so I'm less surprised.
So let me just delve down a little bit more into that. I definitely take your word for it. And it's backed up by my experience that most people working in positions in Washington are motivated by public service. And there's a clear ethic there. But not all of them are required to show the courage, which is sort of a virtue above and beyond what you've just described, that you saw from a number of these characters. That is a rarer virtue. There's a deeper sense of integrity. You said that a lot of them are immigrants or children of immigrants. That's a very interesting point. Could you expand a bit on that?
Well, just, you've heard Alexander Vindman's story or Yevgeny Vindman's story or Fiona Hill's story. And so many of those people, my dad was an immigrant. He came to escape the Nazis, came to this country. 4 years after he got to this country, he was in the United States Army. And he went back to Europe and he fought in World War II. And he spent many of the years of his career working with the U.S. government because he thought it was an incredible privilege. And I was like grown up in suburban New Jersey, and I was like cool. And he would put out the flag on Memorial Day, and I was like, "What? This is jingo. What are you jingoism? What are you doing?" He loved it. A lot of people who come from overseas, except possibly from England.
No. Fiona Hill is a name you just mentioned.
Fiona Hill, but she's from Northern England. They really value these things. It's not one size fits all. You do get Bill Barr, who does terrible things for years, or Mike Pence, who does terrible things for years, and then finally there's a bridge too far. Finally there's one, I'm not going to do that. And, one of the things I wanted to say is we ought to be grateful that at least once they did the right thing. We ought to be able to see that with our eyes open, recognizing that for 3 years they did the wrong thing and contributed to the problem. I think we need to be able to look at it in an adult way. But there were a number, like Marie Yovanovitch and the Vindmans and Bill Taylor, the ambassador, was involved in that particular case, or people like Tony Fauci, who said, I'm going to take my chances and do the right thing. And many of them got fired. Many of them got death threats. Many of them to this day. Olivia Troy. Olivia Troy is one of the people who had sort of inspired me to do this book. Olivia Troy joined the government. Many of you may not know who she is, but she joined the government after 9/11. Said, I want to serve my country. The first place she's assigned to go is Baghdad. She's working in the green zone in Baghdad. And then she's works in the national security community. And then she works in this administration. She works at DHS, and then goes over to join the vice president's staff and gets onto the COVID task force. And at a certain point, she had seen enough. She had said, I have to blow the whistle on this stuff. And to this day, she, like Tony Fauci, like Alex Vindman, they get death threats. They have extra security. We live in a country that has so lost its mind on issues of politics, and yet they were willing to do it. And that's heroism.
I'm thinking we are 2 doors down from Comet Pizza.
Yes, where we will all go later and eat babies.
So it's not just Trump alone. there are enablers, and this is the sort of opposite of the characters in your book. There are people who get Trump up to the brink. They take America back from the brink. They avert calamity at the last minute. They bend the law. They do what's it called, presidential remediation, or remedial presidenting, I think is the term, to try and sort of avert him or give him options that distract him. But there are people who urge him on up to the brink, to the brink, super enablers. Stephen Miller springs to mind. I guess in some respects Jared Kushner springs to mind. And in many respects, some of the people who play good roles at certain points, at really critical points, like Bill Barr, refusing to cooperate with the Stop the Steal narrative, or Mike Pompeo, ditto, they're also super enablers up to a certain point.
And after.
And afterwards, of course. And Bill Barr will still vote for Trump, in spite of everything.
But so Mike Pence, you never know.
So how important are those super enablers? And I want to get into Schedule F later, and the possibility, as you put it, that this is not that we've dodged a bullet, but that we've temporarily avoided a boomerang.
Well, I think it's super important that we recognize, and one of the, I mean, you know, I didn't write the book so that you could have flashbacks. You know, I mean, although I'm glad it had that effect, but it's super important that we recognize this story is not only not over, but the greatest danger lies ahead of us. And the issue is not one individual. Donald Trump has no ideology. Donald Trump is a deeply flawed leader. Donald Trump is not the root cause of American racism or misogyny or anti-LGBTQ behavior or authoritarianism or Christofascism or any of the things that are there. There are millions of people out there who have those views. And if you look at the Republican field right now, with the possible exception of Liz Cheney, if you look at the Republican field of potential 2024 candidates, many of them are worse on these points. Many, I mean, Ron DeSantis has had, had his own little private police force and fired somebody for expressing the idea that maybe someday he might take a position different from Ron DeSantis's, and quashed the distribution of COVID data, and had the "Don't Say Gay" bill and all this, he's the star, right? The press. I pick up the press, not the FT, but I pick up elsewhere in the press, and they're like, "Well, Trump's over, and the new rising star, the big turn of the page is Ron DeSantis." It's not a turn of the page. And some of these people continue onward. Stephen Bannon hasn't gone to jail yet, and he's continuing to work to support the election deniers. I don't know if you followed the story on Friday, but as Speaker Pelosi stood up at the conclusion of what anybody would have to acknowledge was an extraordinary career, the next speaker, the likely next speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, thought it beneath him to attend. He was too busy. What was he doing? He was meeting with Stephen Miller. At that moment, sending that message that these people are the virus of Trumpism, and they are spreading through our body politic. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book was so that we could see how that works, what it looks like, what has been effective in quelling it in the past, and what they learned from it, so that perhaps going into the future, they'll be more successful at gutting the things that we value in our system.
I mean, that's to pick up on that, take an example. You go into some detail, very interesting episode of Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, and Mark Milley, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, having to do that perp walk across Lafayette Square, and then realizing and pulling back that this was a ghastly political photo op, and then did a lot of work in between then, which was June and November, trying to prevent what they saw coming, which is what happened. What would have happened if Mike Flynn had been Secretary of Defense, or Chris Miller, the guy who became the acting SecDef after Esper was fired? I mean, you talk about how close we got. Would we have gone over if the military had been, the Pentagon had been run by somebody who had agreed to seize ballot boxes as Trump demanded?
Yeah. I mean, we came incredibly close to that. I mean, Flynn was in the Oval Office at the end of December, passing this view on. And there were a lot of people around Trump saying, don't meet with him. He's dangerous. His close, advisors, his general counsel and other, keep him out. And Trump was like, no, I'm going to sit. And they stayed there all late into the night trying to talk that through. And Chris Miller and the Defense Department, I don't think we fully get what happened on January 6th in terms of where the government should have been responsive and it wasn't. And, that is DOD to some extent, the National Guard to some extent. There is a big scandal within the Secret Service that we're just scratching the surface of. I mean, clearly Pence was afraid to get in a car in the Capitol because he didn't know which Secret Service agents were driving the car and if they'd take him to some undisclosed location and silence him, right? And clearly there were some Secret Service agents who were like, no, Mr. President, I'm not taking you to the Capitol. And there were other ones who were like, let's do this. And there were some who were saying, oh yeah, this crowd is armed. Let's look the other way. I can see a guy in a tree with a gun. Let's look the other way. And the president says, let them in without going through the metal detectors. And they're like, oh, okay. And so there are many people within the government who enabled him. And I think that's another point. The subtitle of the book is how the deep state saved the nation. It really should have been how the deep state tried to save the nation. How the deep state periodically saved the nation. But the battle's not over by any stretch of the imagination, and they weren't successful in every case.
I'm glad you mentioned Pence, because I was going to get to him. There's a great description, I can't remember who you're quoting, of Pence being an HOV lane inflatable dummy up until this point, which is better than a mannequin. Or actually airline pilot was the one I had in my head. It's just a perfect...
A movie Airplane.
Yeah, he just looks like an airline pilot. But he stepped up, and as you remind us in this book, the person who was probably key in terms of getting him to do the right thing on January the 6th with the certification was Dan Quayle. How it did occur to me that, if the future of the Republic depends on good advice from Dan Quayle, then it's hanging by a thread. But somehow...
But let me interrupt you there. That was a different Republican Party. Those were a different day. Dan Quayle may not have been a rocket scientist, and although he did go off and get incredibly wealthy after leaving the government, so he knew how to do something that I never figured out how to do. But he in the George H.W. Bush administration, that was a different crowd. There was an element of public service in what they were doing. Now, by the way, I don't think they were out of the woods entirely either. Trumpism didn't sort of emerge. It's been coming for the past 60 years. And every, leader in that party contributed to it in some way.
No, I mean, point taken about it being a different Republican Party and Dan Quayle not being a rocket scientist, so I can't resist quoting his "It's time for humans to enter the solar system," being one of my favorite Quaylisms. So this intra-Hoosier advice worked in this case, and Pence obviously trusts people from Indiana a lot. That did make a difference. What if, and here I'm inviting you to be speculative, what if the vice president had been Ron DeSantis or somebody else? Take your pick. Why did Pence, really something we wouldn't necessarily have forecast, do the right, suddenly find his spine at this moment?
Well, first of all, let's remind ourselves that he almost didn't. Like, he was like at the very last minute calling people up going, I don't know, what should I do here? Should I blow up democracy or not? So, if that was a tough one for him, I just think, we don't want to give him too much credit for this. But, he comes from a tradition of rule followers. I mean, he is from the evangelical wing of the Republican Party. I think he was troubled by some of the notions at the core of that, and that's to his credit. Now he also manages to take those same teachings and say, I believe everybody in the United States should follow my rules, the rules of the sect I believe in, which is, I think, antithetical to the principles of which the country was founded, but rules mattered to him. And so I think at the end of the day, he was searching in his own way for the moral thing to do. Now, let's go back. He was Donald Trump's vice president. He did know what kind of man Donald Trump was. He did see what the administration was doing and supported it on a Muslim ban, an immigration ban that was designed to keep people of color out of the country, and so forth. So he was definitely not a saint in most of his tenure.
So in about 5-10 minutes, we'll take questions, and when we do the mic, you have to stand behind that mic. But let me ask 2 or 3 more questions. And one is just a current event, which is Merrick Garland's appointment of a special counsel, Jack Smith, producing a potential Mr. Smith goes to Washington situation, a person of the type that you feature in your book. Could this be that moment? Can I ask you to think through what Jack Smith might mean for Trump's future?
I don't know. I mean, he seems like the right kind of guy. He seems like he's got the right kind of background. He seems moral. All the reasons that Merrick Garland gave for appointing him, he knew in January of 2021. So, waiting till now is a bit of a mystery, as far as I'm concerned. I think he said he did it because Trump is running again, but Trump's been running all along, and he said he was running all along. And Biden is running again, and he wants to keep this, above the stench of politics. But, of course, the opponents of this immediately disregarded that and politicized it and discounted what he was doing. And no matter what he does, the opponents, and Trump, of course, are going to say this was, political persecution. So I'm not sure there was much value to that. The area where I think there was some value in him making this choice was because he's bending over backwards to restore the credibility of the Department of Justice. And he may be hyper cautious, too slow. There are a lot of things that we can criticize him for, but the Department of Justice needed that. Doing a little bit too much to appear to have integrity is better than doing too little, right? And having said that, unless Donald Trump is held accountable for his crimes, this discussion is moot, right? And so he may be the right guy. But, if we're sitting there in 2025, continuing to have this discussion, and that could be the case. In fact, one of the reasons people said, having a special counsel may be a good idea is because it could go on after the Biden administration. Then we've got a problem so deep that the integrity of these men is of little consequence. Okay,
I mentioned earlier your boomerang, dodging a bullet quote. that this might actually just be a temporary avoidance. And you talked about Trump being prematurely written off. Clearly, the midterm elections have given people the fact that the most Trumpian of candidates mostly got defeated, and that Trump's 2024 launch from Mar-a-Lago was a damp squib, has given people maybe this false sense of confidence that we're past peak Trump. But let's say that we're not, and Trump comes back to office. Now, he's not going to read this book, he doesn't read books, but he's going to be aware that certain types of people thwarted his desire to put out of NATO, whatever it might have been, to build a wall. What is it that a second Trump administration would look like? Who would he appoint to the key positions? And how would we be able to stop it then, since he'd be starting not from zero, as he did last time, but from a much, much higher number because of everything he knows?
Well, first of all, I don't think Donald Trump is going to be the next president of the United States. I don't even think he's going to be the Republican candidate. I think he's over. I don't think Trumpism is over. I don't think the MAGA GOP movement is over. I think that, as I said earlier, most of the candidates who are leaders within the party will carry those ideas forward. And you've heard some of the ideas, including one that I think you were getting at, this Schedule F idea of being able to let so many people in the government go, is now being adopted by the party at large. Newt Gingrich, that defender of democracy, has said he thinks that's a good idea. And people like DeSantis and others have said, or implied that they would do that. And so, basically, Trump didn't know how to be president, and some of the people around Trump didn't know how to be president. And they've gotten in and they've seen what impedes them, and they are trying to dismantle it. And now, Richard Nixon was brought down by not just the DOJ, but the media. And Roger Ailes said, we need our own media to offset the liberal media. And so an enterprise began in the 70s that became Fox News in the 90s and became, right-wing echo chamber in the 2000s. And so that was an effort to break down some of the resistance that they have seen. Ronald Reagan saying government is the enemy is an effort to break down some of that. The Gingrich Revolution in the 90s in the Congress did the same thing. The Federalist Society saw that courts were going to be a problem, but if you handled things in a certain kind of way, you could tilt the court in a direction. And we now have the prospect of a Supreme Court that is not only no longer a guardrail against irresponsible activity, it will be an engine of acceleration of irresponsible activity for the next 10 or 20 years. I mean, that's more likely than not, right? And the Federalist Society began doing this work a long time ago, just as they began doing the work of taking state legislatures in a systematic way so that gerrymandering could take place. So again, this is a 60-year enterprise, and it has happened incrementally along the way. And, among the things that the Trump chapter learned was that federal government officials were a guardrail, and they will want to get in and put in acting department heads so they don't have to have Senate confirmation. They want to put in their own inspector generals so you don't have whistleblowing activities. They want to, embed sort of their own deep state, which I refer to in the book as the dark state, and which they have. There are people still there in, I don't want to be specific, but the Inspector General in the Department of Homeland Security, for example. But, there are people who are still there in the system who've been implanted, to sort of make it easier for this transition to take place. So it's not just Trump. It is a long-term systematic enterprise.
So what does, by the way, questions after this question, I want to take questions from the audience, but reminder, it's next to the microphone, not from your seat. So Trumpism 2.0, but without Trump, whether it's DeSantis or Nikki Haley or whoever it might be, Mike Pompeo, Kirsty Noem, I mean, there are plenty of people auditioning. Does it differ only in style from Trump, or does it differ in substance in any way? Because I know a lot of people are perhaps reassuring themselves that, well, after Trump, the worst has gone. But maybe you could look at it the other way around, which is that, well, minus the capriciousness, minus the unpredictability, minus the incompetence, you actually get something worse.
Well, I think you do. Look at Florida and Texas. I mean, those are the Petri dishes for this.
Peach tree dishes, I think is Marjorie Taylor Greene's. Sorry.
Yeah, the Peachtree dishes. But look and see what you see in those places. The not just efforts to slow abortion or to stop it, but to charge doctors, cab drivers, people who enable it, draconian, as reminiscent of the worst that you've seen in repressive regimes. Efforts to ban books, including math books that have word problems, that are politically incorrect. The effort to attack wokeness, which after all means tolerance, right? Goodness in your art, right? No, that's bad. We can't have too much of that. But if you look, you talk about the people who won in the Paxton won in Texas, who's among other things a criminal, but a really bad guy, and a lot of election deniers won at the state level and so forth. So it could be worse because the views have grown more extreme than I thought was humanly possible. Congressmen posing with anti-tank weapons on their Christmas cards. Think about how warped that is, and yet that's the rank and file, right? That's where that party is going.
Yeah, I promised on Twitter to rush outside and hug strangers if Lauren Boebert lost, but I haven't hugged anybody.
I think to tip the election in her favor.
Maybe.
Thank you for this very interesting book and discussion. Two quick questions. One is, does the Hatch Act provide any guardrails for the Schedule F dilemma? And the second question is, who is Ron DeSantis? He went to an Ivy League law school. Did he have to take constitutional law? Trump didn't know what the Constitution was. Aren't they different people?
Well, first of all, the Hatch Act should help, but it's never enforced. So it won't. It should, but we don't enforce the Hatch Act. So, Kellyanne Conway, there were a bunch of examples you can think of recently where that it wasn't enforced. Secondly, Ron DeSantis went to an Ivy League school. Ted Cruz went to an Ivy League school. Josh Hawley went to an Ivy League school. Mike Pompeo went to an Ivy League school. I went to an Ivy League school. It does not. It does, it's just people, and some of them are jerks. And in fact, I've taught it in an Ivy League school, and I have to say, many of them are jerks. And you get all kinds. I do think he's different. That's why I think he's more dangerous. He's smarter. He knows the law. He knows how to make things a little bit more acceptable. I think he's a little less dangerous because, and this is, hard for me to say, but there is some perverse snake oil salesman charm to Donald Trump, right? I mean, he was on TV. Ron DeSantis has the charm of a Gila monster. He's like, he has none. So, and Dave, I don't know if you saw his debate with Charlie Crist, and Charlie Crist says, "Are you going to run, for president?" And DeSantis just seethed. He was like visibly seething, and he just couldn't handle it. So, they all have their strengths and their weaknesses, but I'm particularly concerned about the strengths they will use against our weaknesses.
Thank you.
So my late husband and I met at an Ivy League school, Yale Law School. And we came to, and we both were civil servants. He died as a civil servant. He was 52. And he had worked his way up from a GS-11 to the head of the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. It didn't require Senate confirmation back then. That was the Clinton administration. But we were here starting in the 1970s. And in those days, going to work for government was considered an honorable thing to do. Yale being Yale, first it was to be a professor, and then it was to be a government employee, and then the C students made the money. That was how they said it. And it sounds like the people that you were talking to and about were what we called Schedule C. They were political appointments, or they didn't have civil service protection. Schedule B did. And in other words, the great mass of us who were not in policy-making positions, who just did the work of government. I was at the FDA and later on at the EPA under Reagan, to whom I was totally opposed. What I did see was that the people who stayed, the career civil servants, were very often Democrats, because the Republicans thought civil service was, only the poor and the weak and the cousins. If you couldn't make it in business, you could go to government. Did you think about them? They were the ones that Schedule F was aimed at, to remove civil service protection from everybody.
Of course. I spoke to many of them. I spoke to career Foreign Service officers. I spoke to career civil servants. I spoke to career intelligence officers. I spoke to career military officers. I spoke to, people up and down the GS scale and up and down the SES scale, and as well as.
But like GS-12s and 15s and
of course.
The people who do the work.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I was, I ran the International Trade Administration. We had 2,400 people. I know these people well. And I talked to all of them. And Schedule F is aimed at those people because they're the ones who have the protections. And the whole idea is to get rid of people who have protections. But a lot of the people who, there's a kind of a class of people that we don't, that falls in between, right? It's people who are government professionals, who tend to be lawyers, or there's something else. They work outside the government, then they go into the government, they come out. And there are people who are in this administration. You mentioned Mark Esper, or Kirstjen Nielsen, or, we can think of a lot of people like this who were in prior administrations, who worked under different sort of systems. And so I think they were worthy of consideration as well, because their professionalism helped us.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we can all agree that party polarization is getting really bad in this country, and I think we'll see that probably around the Thanksgiving table too. And I'm kind of thinking that each party is kind of just trying to stop the other party. That's kind of like democracy today. Do you think there's going to be a time where we can get more bipartisan support just to try to like greater the country?
I hope so. And for those of you who are facing these divides over your Thanksgiving tables, I feel for you. Not my Thanksgiving table, by the way. But I don't think bipartisanship of the traditional kind is on the near horizon. But it is possible in small ways. And I think we've been very fortunate to have a very old school president who comes from that tradition. And if the bipartisan infrastructure bill was, the Republican support was still a minority of the Republicans, he was seeking it because he felt that validated it and it sent a message. If having Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger on the January 6th Commission was not the desire of most Republicans, they were nonetheless Republicans. And it was making an effort in that direction. By the way, the president's taken a lot of heat sometimes for saying we need to reach out to the other side or that these people are good people. And sometimes it sounds even a little bit out of touch. But is it in our interest? It is. And would we be better off if we aspired to that ideal of having philosophical differences with the other party, but having, a shared interest in a better country and certain common principles? We'd be better off.
Thank you.
Thank you for this book and presentation today. You mentioned that you interviewed 100 people for this book, and I was wondering, how did you go about selecting these people? How many presented themselves to you? How many did you reach out to? Was there anyone who you couldn't get in touch with or who refused to speak to you? You don't have to name names. But, and did people speak freely, or did you have to conceal their identities as you relay their stories in the book?
I think I reached out to almost there were some people who I had encountered. Ed and I do this podcast. I've this little company, which I like to refer to as the world's smallest media company, where we do 6 or 7 podcasts a week. And so some of them had come on the podcasts. And in fact, talking to them on the podcast was one of the reasons that I thought about doing the book, because I thought their stories were interesting, particularly, by the way, and I apologize for this, but the stories that they tell after we turn off the microphones, and we're zooming and we're starting to tell these stories. There were some people, mostly sort of high-level administration official, cabinet level, and I spoke to a number, not just the ones that were quoted, who didn't want to speak. And I'll tell you, I think the main reason they didn't want to speak was that they feared retribution of some sort, political retribution or black mark, and or people coming after them. Most people were very forthcoming. Some people asked that some parts of it be off the record, and so some parts of it are off the record. But most of them also had a lot they wanted to get off their chest.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, we've got 3 or 4 more questions, but only 5 minutes. So if you could keep your questions short and sweet.
Yeah, quick one.
Or you can ask a long question. I'll give a short
I'll
answer.
give you a short answer. Given the makeup of this coming Congress in January, what are the chances, this is asking speculation, of moderates actually working with Democrats given the House? There are moderates in the House, Republicans, of getting anything done.
I think the chances exist on some issues. So, for example, Ukraine. There's a lot of Republicans who are like, we shouldn't give any more money to Ukraine. But there's enough who think that we should, that'll happen. I think there may be some crazy ideas about shutting down the government or blowing up the debt ceiling and stuff like that. And I think some moderates may keep us from doing absolutely crazy stuff. But, you know, you've lived through this time as I have, and we're regularly disappointed by the outcomes, so I don't know.
I'm just curious to know your opinion of the trajectory of Lynn Cheney. Where do you see...
Liz Cheney.
I'm sorry. Liz Cheney, not Lynn.
I mean, because Lynn would be easy.
Lynn is her mother, I know, yeah. Sorry, Liz. Where do you see the trajectory?
I don't know. I think she will probably end up being a gadfly in the Republican Party. I don't think she's going to win broad Republican support. She might run for president as a way of paring off some support for some of the more extreme people in the party, and that would be a big service. And, you know, come time for the next Democratic administration, when they're looking to make some bipartisan appointments, she might get one.
Thank you.
Just a quick thank you from those of us who follow you on Twitter, not just your podcast. You help explain a lot of things that are not clear from the news. Where do we find you? And assuming that Twitter implodes, maybe that's not a fair assumption, where do you see that going? And if we had a longer time, I would ask you, what do we do about Fox News and organizations like Twitter that really do perpetuate the lie?
Well, first of all, thank you. And secondly, I'm not going anywhere right at the moment. I'm sticking with Twitter. I tried to go to Mastodon. Yesterday morning, somebody said, you know, there are 4 David Rothkopf accounts on Mastodon. Which one are you? And I looked, and like 3 of them had like the little, you know, sunflower that I have next to my as my avatar, and I was like, okay, I'm out of here. I can't. And they're like, no, but you could find a nice little node in Mastodon, and it'll be, you know. And I was like, no, way too complicated for me. Okay, I mean, my daughter put me on Twitter. Like, you know, I didn't do this on my own. And so I'll stick with it for a while. And we use other platforms for Deep State Radio. So we use TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, and I think we'll be doing more. I actually think more media will have more video in it in the future. And so I think platforms are going to evolve a little bit in that direction.
Maybe you can write about Fox News in your next book.
Well, I'll say one thing about Fox News, or two. It looks like I have 60 seconds. One is, a good alternative to Twitter is this. Mm-hmm. You know, you get people together in a room. You talk, you share ideas. If you want to wear a mask, wear a mask. You know what I'm saying? You know, it's like more of this is good. As far as Fox News goes, I think it's one of the most fascinating stories that there ever was. And it really involves, you know, you need to go back to that Roger Ailes thing. And then, you know, Rupert Murdoch comes to the country and he wants to get in with the government so that he can become a citizen, so that he can buy a thing. And who helps him do it? Roy Cohn, you know, who's working with Donald Trump, you know, or Donald Trump. And they're connecting them. And he connects Murdoch to Bill Casey, who's running the CIA, and Bill Casey says, I can't do PR for my campaign in Central America. So, you know, Murdoch says, well, I'll do it. And I bought, you know, the New York Post. I'll do it here. And then Casey goes, okay, well, I'll help you with Reagan. And then the next thing you know, he's a citizen overnight. And then he's buying Metro Media News. And then 2 years later, they're getting rid of the Fairness Doctrine. And, you know, 4 or 5 years after that, Fox News is being established, and you know, as that you know, over the period from the mid '90s to, you know, 5 years ago, the right wing media bubble really exploded. The internet really helped to explode it, and you know, I mean, there are a lot of responses to that. It's not going to go away overnight, and 7 or 8 out of the top 10 media moguls they're not, that old thing about liberal media. It's not. They're conservatives or they're libertarians. They're like Musk. So we're up against it. Yeah. And I think we need to do a couple of things that range from teaching critical reasoning skills to students in schools all the way through to using social media, recognizing that if you're on Twitter or you're on TikTok or you're on Facebook or you're on Instagram, and you really look like a TikTok crowd to me, but if you're on any of those things and you've got 5 followers or 20 followers or 100 followers, you don't have to have hundreds of thousands of followers, and you share, that's good, 1,500 is good, but you share it, you're having a bigger impact than any other group of people in the history of the world on each other. And every single person in this room is a media node and is a platform and is a filter and is an endorser. And if you see a candidate you like and you share it, you can amplify it and you can help them raise money. Or if you see something that's a lie and, say randomly, Chuck Todd isn't saying it's a lie on TV. You can say it's a lie, and so I think there's a huge amount of responsibility that falls on all of us, as there has been, and even now on Twitter, even as Elon Musk is trying to destroy it in almost comical ways, right? I mean, no, I know the one you're thinking about, and we're not going to describe it, but he's a revolting character, but we're still able to use it, and the penny hasn't dropped that we're the product, that we own Twitter. He doesn't own it because it's us, and so we actually have some agency in this, and we can use that agency, and that's the main message. We have to use our agency, right?
That's a reassuring closing. Thank you.
And you can tweet about his book as well. That's a rousing way to end this. Thank you, David. It's an excellent book. Buy it. Get David to sign it. Ask him the question you didn't ask him when he's signing it. And thank you very much for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Copies of David's book are available.